Doctor stood in the great hall of the Galactic Scientific Consortium. Above her head, the dome showed the stars of 12 different alien. Each star represented a species that had mastered space travel thousands of years before humans ever looked up at their own sky. Felt small, but she kept her back straight. She had come here with humanity's greatest dream. Today, the galaxy would tell her if that dream was possible. The consortium chamber was massive. 12 different alien species sat around her in a perfect circle. Some breathed different air, so they sat behind force fields. Others were so large they appeared only as holograms. A few were so small she could barely see them. At the center of the circle stood the delegate. His people looked like tall, thin humans covered in silver skin that seemed to shimmer like water. The had changed 43 dead worlds into garden planets. If anyone knew about making life grow where it should not, it was them. Doctor, the said, his voice like wind through metal. You have asked us to review humanity's proposal to terraform Mars. We have studied your planet. We have studied Mars. Our answer is simple. He gestured, and a hologram of Mars appeared in the air between them. The red planet spun slowly, looking cold and dead. Mars cannot support life, he continued. This is not our opinion, this is scientific fact. Another alien spoke up. This one was made of living crystal, its voice like breaking glass. We have created atmospheres for 60 worlds. Mars has no atmosphere worth the name. The air pressure is less than 1% of Earth's. Nothing can breathe there. The temperature, added a third voice, averages minus 80 degrees. No liquid water can exist on the surface for long. Watched more holograms appear around Mars. Charts, numbers, calculations, all of them saying the same thing, impossible. The continued, the soil is poison. It contains chemicals that would kill any Earth plant in hours. The radiation from space hits the surface with no protection. No magnetic field exists to shield life. We have calculated the energy needed to change these conditions, said the. Even with our most advanced technology, it would take 50,000 years to create an atmosphere. It would take another 10,000 to clean the soil. The magnetic field problem has no solution we know of. Around the circle, the other species nodded. Some made sounds that's translator told her meant agreement. The raised one long finger. Doctor, we do not tell you this to be cruel. We have seen many species try to change worlds that cannot be changed. They waste their resources, their time, their lives. Always they fail. Your people are new to space, added another alien that looked like a floating jellyfish made of light. You have only one colony on your moon. You have never tried to terraform anything. Mars is not a good place to start. Looked around the circle. 12 species, thousands of years of experience, hundreds of successful terraforming projects between them, all telling her that humanity's greatest dream was impossible. She thought about Earth, about the billions of people looking up at the red dot in their sky and dreaming of walking on another world, about the children who drew pictures of Martian cities and asked when they could visit. Your calculations are correct, she said finally. The aliens made satisfied sounds, the nodded. Then you understand Mars cannot be terraformed. No, said. I understand that Mars cannot be terraformed the way you would terraform it. The chamber went quiet. Stepped forward. You've told us what can't be done. You've shown us your methods, your timelines, your requirements. They're all based on one idea, make Mars like the worlds you already know how to change. She pointed at the hologram of Mars. But what if we don't make Mars like Earth? What if we make Mars into something new, something that has never existed before? They made a sound like crystal wind chimes in a storm. Impossible. Life requires specific conditions. These conditions do not exist on Mars and cannot be created in any reasonable time. Life requires specific conditions that you know about, said. But humans have always been good at making life work in places where it shouldn't. She thought about her ancestors, people who had lived in deserts, in frozen mountains, in places where the planet itself seemed to want them dead. They had not just survived, they had thrived. We lived in caves during ice ages, she said. We built cities in swamps and on cliffs and in places where you couldn't grow food. Every time experts told us it couldn't be done. Every time we did it anyway. The silver skin rippled. Doctor, we respect human determination, but this is not about courage or willpower. This is about physics, about chemistry, about the basic requirements of life itself. Smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile her grandmother had worn when doctors told her she would never walk again after her accident. The same smile her grandfather had shown when everyone said his farm would fail in the drought. "You're right," she said. "This is about the basic requirements of life, but here's what you don't understand about humans. When we can't meet the requirements, we change them." She walked to the edge of the circle. "We're going to Mars. We're going to make it live. Maybe it'll take us 50 years instead of your 50,000. Maybe it'll look nothing like any world you've ever seen, but it will live." The chamber erupted in sounds translator couldn't handle, protests in 12 different languages. The raised his hands for quiet. The consortium's recommendation is that humanity focus its resources on more achievable goals. Venus with atmospheric control, Europa with underwater colonies. Mars will never support life. Nodded politely. "Thank you for your recommendation." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and send us your calculations, all of them. We'll want to know exactly what's supposed to be impossible." As she walked toward the exit, she heard the ask, "What are they going to do with that information?" Called back over her shoulder, "We're going to prove it wrong." The great doors closed behind her. Above, the stars of 12 alien worlds looked down like watching eyes. 3 days later, Earth's terraforming council tripled the Mars project budget. Dr. James stood on the surface of Mars, looking at what everyone said was impossible. Through his helmet, he could see the endless red desert stretching to the horizon. The sky was the color of rust, and so thin that without his suit, he would die in seconds. "Perfect," he said into his radio. His team thought he was joking. James wasn't joking. Mars was exactly what he needed for his plan. 2 years had passed since returned from the Galactic Consortium. 2 years of the aliens telling Earth that the Mars project was doomed. 2 years of humans saying, "Watch us." The first ships had arrived 8 months ago. Not just colonists, but entire laboratories, factories, and something the galaxy had never seen before: mobile ecosystem pods. Each pod contained thousands of organisms that didn't exist anywhere in the universe except in human imagination. "Status report," came Commander Sarah's voice over the radio. She was in orbit, managing the construction of what humans called the Prometheus Array. "First seeding starts tomorrow," James replied. "The organisms are ready." James looked at the container beside him. Inside were billions of microorganisms that had taken human scientists 3 years to design. They weren't modified Earth bacteria. They were something completely new, built from scratch using human knowledge of genetics and powerful computers. Each organism was designed to do one thing: survive on Mars while slowly changing it. Doctor called out Maria Santos, his lead biologist. "The observation ship is back." James looked up. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there. For months, alien ships had been coming to watch the human project. They stayed just long enough to take measurements, then left shaking their heads. They kept sending reports to the consortium. "Humans proceeding with impossible project," they said. "Predict failure within 1 year." "Let them watch," James said. He opened the first container. The organisms inside looked like nothing special, just gray-green slime that moved slowly in the Martian cold. But these tiny things had been designed to eat Mars's poisoned soil and turn it into something useful. They could live in radiation that would kill most Earth life. They could work with almost no oxygen. Most importantly, they were programmed to evolve. "Beginning first release," James announced. He poured the slime onto the red ground. It spread out slowly, looking for the chemicals it had been designed to find. Within minutes, it began to change color as it started eating Mars. Around him, his team released more containers, different organisms for different jobs. Some would work on the soil. Others would help create a better atmosphere. Still others would prepare the way for the next phase. Above them, Commander was managing her own impossible project. The Prometheus Array looked like a flower made of mirrors, each one the size of a city. But instead of just reflecting sunlight to warm Mars, the mirrors were programmed to create complex light patterns. "Atmospheric processing begins in 5, 4, 3, counted down. The mirrors moved. Suddenly, Mars was getting sunlight in patterns no planet had ever received before. The light hit the atmosphere in ways designed to trigger chemical reactions. Not the slow reactions that had taken Earth millions of years, but fast ones that humans had planned using their computers. First weather pattern detected, reported its atmospheric team. On the surface, James felt wind that hadn't blown on Mars for millions of years. The aliens watching took more measurements and left, more confused than before. 3 months later, Doctor arrived with the next wave of colonists. She was an expert in alien life, but her job on Mars wasn't to study alien life, it was to create it. "How are our little friends doing?" she asked James as they walked through what humans were starting to call the first garden. The ground under their feet was no longer pure red. Patches of brown and green showed where the organisms were working. The air was still too thin to breathe, but instruments showed it was getting thicker every day. "Better than predicted," James said. "They're evolving faster than we thought they would." This was the part that the aliens couldn't understand. Other species terraformed by bringing their own life to new worlds. They used plants and animals that already worked, trying to make the new world just like their old one. Humans were creating life that had never existed before, life that was designed specifically for Mars. "They sent another research team," said. "They want to understand how our atmospheric processing works." James smiled inside his helmet. The crystalline aliens were masters of atmosphere creation, but they were confused by the human approach. Instead of forcing Mars to have an Earth-like atmosphere, humans were creating a completely new kind of air. Still breathable, but different. "What did we tell them?" James asked. "The truth," replied. "That we're not making Mars like Earth, we're making Mars the best version of Mars it can be." 6 months later, the impossible started looking merely difficult. The Galactic Consortium sent its first official research vessel. The captain was a named who had terraformed 5 worlds personally. He came expecting to document human failure. Instead, he found something that broke every rule he knew. "This should not be working," he told, who had returned to Mars as director of operations. They stood in the observation dome of New Angels, the first human city built on the Martian surface. Through the clear dome, they could see the landscape changing. Small plants that looked like blue crystals grew in soil that should have been poison. The sky was still orange, but clouds moved through it now. "The atmospheric pressure has increased by 12% in 1 year," continued. "Our models said this would take decades, even with our technology." Pointed to a group of human children playing in the dome's garden. They were laughing as they watched Martian butterfly plants flutter around flowers that glowed softly in the thin sunlight. "Your models were based on your methods," she said. "We're not using your methods." "But the organisms you've created," said. "They violate basic principles of biology. They're too efficient. They evolve too quickly." "They do exactly what we designed them to do," replied. That night sent a message to the consortium that caused chaos in the galactic scientific community. "Human terraforming project shows signs of success. Request immediate investigation." The response came back within hours. "This is impossible." Looked out at Mars, where aurora lights danced in an atmosphere that was getting thicker every day, powered by an artificial magnetic field that humans had somehow created using methods no one else understood. "No," he transmitted back. "This is Tuesday." By the end of the second year, aliens were no longer betting on when the human project would fail. They were betting on how long it would take other species to figure out what humans were doing. The answer, it turned out, was that they were doing everything wrong according to the textbooks. And it was working perfectly. Doctor stared at her computer screen and checked the results for the 3rd time. The numbers didn't change. They were impossible, but they were also definitely real. "James, you need to see this," she called across the laboratory. Doctor was working with a sample of new soil from the Valls Canyon. The soil that had been completely dead 3 years ago now showed signs of complex chemistry, but what it found was something much stranger. "What is it?" James asked, walking over to her station. "Remember the organisms we designed to break down the toxic chemicals in the Martian soil," said. "Of course, they're working perfectly." "They're working too perfectly," pointed at her screen. "Look at this chemical analysis." James studied the data. The organisms were supposed to eat the harmful chemicals and produce simpler, safer compounds. Instead, they were creating complex organic molecules that looked almost like Is this what I think it is? James asked quietly. DNA, confirmed. But not the DNA from our organisms. This is something else, something older. They stared at each other through their helmet visors. Outside the laboratory, Mars continued its impossible transformation. But inside, two humans had just discovered that the impossible had become much more complicated. Run the comparison analysis, James said. His fingers moved quickly over her keyboard. The computer compared the strange DNA with samples from Earth and with the genetic codes of all the organisms humans had brought to Mars. No match to anything from Earth, reported. No match to any of our engineered organisms either. Then where did it come from? The computer finished its analysis and displayed the answer, read the results twice before speaking. It's a 97% match to fossilized genetic material from rocks that are 4 billion years old. James, our organisms aren't just terraforming Mars, they're bringing it back to life. Within hours, every human scientist on Mars was studying samples from different locations. The results were the same everywhere. The engineered organisms weren't just surviving on Mars. They were finding traces of ancient Martian life that had been sleeping in the rocks for billions of years and somehow bringing it back. Commander Sarah received the report in orbit while managing the Prometheus array. "Explain this to me again," she asked during their daily briefing. "Our organisms were designed to work with Mars's chemistry," said. "But Mars's chemistry included things we didn't know about, traces of life that died out when the planet lost its atmosphere. Our organisms are waking that life up and combining with it." "Is it dangerous?" "We don't know yet, but the results are spectacular." Sarah looked down at Mars through her observation window. The planet below was no longer the red desert that humans had first seen. Green and blue patches spread across the surface like paint drops in water. But the colors weren't Earth colors. They were something new. "The research ship is back," her communications officer reported. "Let them land," Sarah said. "They're going to want to see this." Captain returned to Mars expecting to find progress. He was not prepared for what he actually found. The human city of New Angels had grown. Instead of the small dome he remembered, a complex of interconnected buildings spread across several kilometers. But the buildings looked wrong to his alien eyes. They seemed to grow out of the ground instead of being built on top of it. "How did you construct these so quickly?" he asked as they walked through the streets. "We didn't construct them," replied. "We grew them." She led him to a construction site where humans were working with organisms that looked like coral, but were clearly designed for building. The coral creatures were growing into the shape of a new laboratory, following plans that were somehow programmed into their DNA. "This is impossible," said automatically. It had become his most common phrase when visiting Mars. "The building coral is just the beginning," said. "Come see the real miracle." They took a transport to Vols, the great canyon that had been carved into Mars billions of years ago. When had last seen it, the canyon was a dry, empty crack in the planet's surface. Now it was green. "The first Martian forest," announced. Stared down into the canyon. Plants that looked like crystal trees grew from the canyon walls. They glowed softly in the thin sunlight, and their leaves moved even though there was no wind he could detect. "These are not Earth plants," he said. "No," agreed. "They're not engineered organisms either. They're something that Mars created itself with a little help from our friends." She explained how the human organisms had found sleeping Martian DNA and somehow convinced it to start growing again. But the ancient Martian life didn't just come back the way it had been 4 billion years ago. It came back adapted for the Mars of today, combined with human engineering in ways that should have been impossible. "The trees photosynthesize using both sunlight and geothermal energy from deep in the canyon," continued. "They can live in the low air pressure. They actually prefer the cold temperatures, and they're creating their own weather system." As if to demonstrate, clouds began forming around the crystal trees. Not normal clouds, but colorful mists that moved in patterns that seemed almost alive. "The atmospheric readings," said, consulting his instruments. "The pressure in this canyon is higher than the surface average." "The trees are making their own atmosphere," said proudly. "They take in the carbon dioxide that Mars has plenty of and turn it into a mix that's much more useful. In 5 years, we estimate the canyon will have breathable air." Without breathing equipment. Without breathing equipment. That night sent his most detailed report yet to the Galactic Consortium. He described plants that shouldn't exist, building techniques that violated known physics, and atmospheric conditions that were changing too fast to measure accurately. The reply from the consortium was predictable. This is impossible. But this time was ready with an answer. I am standing in an impossible forest, breathing impossible air, watching impossible aurora in an impossible sky. Perhaps it is time to expand our definition of possible. The response took 3 days to arrive. Send detailed samples and data. We are dispatching a full research fleet. Meanwhile, in laboratories around Mars, human scientists were making new discoveries every day. The combination of human engineering and ancient Martian life was creating ecosystems that had never existed anywhere in the universe. Doctor discovered organisms that could live on radiation, turning harmful cosmic rays into useful energy. Doctor found bacteria that could create magnetic fields, solving the problem of Mars's missing magnetosphere one small area at a time. Most amazing of all were the atmospheric organisms. They didn't just produce oxygen. They created complex gas mixtures that were better than Earth's atmosphere in many ways. The air they made was easier to breathe at low pressure, more resistant to radiation, and somehow able to carry complex chemical signals that helped other organisms coordinate their activities. It's like the planet is learning to live again, told the daily briefing. But it's learning to live better than it ever did before. Above Mars, Commander watched weather patterns that looked like art. The artificial magnetic field created by human technology and Martian organisms working together was generating aurora displays that painted the sky in colors that had no names. Status report, she asked her atmospheric team. Atmospheric pressure up 38% from original, came the reply. Temperature rising in all terraformed areas, oxygen levels increasing faster than predicted. How much faster? We're ahead of schedule by approximately 400 years. Looked down at Mars. The planet was no longer red. It was green and blue and gold, with swirls of color that moved like a living thing. Send a message to Earth, she instructed. Tell them Mars is ready for the next phase. Which is? We're going to make it beautiful. Maya took her first breath of Martian air on her 18th birthday. She had been born on Mars, but like all children, she had always lived in the protected domes and cities. Today, she would walk on the surface with nothing but light clothing and a small oxygen booster. Ready? Asked her father, Dr. James. Maya nodded. Her generation had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. She was part of the first group of true Martians, children who had grown up watching an impossible world become possible. They walked through the airlock of New Angels. Outside, Mars looked nothing like the pictures in old Earth textbooks. The sky was blue. Not Earth blue, but a deeper, richer color that seemed to glow from within. Clouds moved across it in patterns that spiraled and danced. The aurora that had once only appeared at night now painted ribbons of light across the day sky. How does it feel? James asked. Maya breathed deeply. The air was thin but rich. It tasted of growing things and rain and something else she couldn't name, something that made her think of home. It feels like Mars, she said. They walked through the city streets, but Maya barely noticed the buildings. Her attention was on the horizon, where the crystal forests caught the sunlight and threw it back in colors that had no names. New Angels had grown beyond all predictions. The buildings rose from the ground like living things, their walls made from the same coral organisms that had helped terraform the soil. Streets flowed like rivers, following the natural patterns of the land. Gardens grew on every roof and balcony, filled with plants that were neither earthborn nor fully Martian, but something wonderfully new. The Galactic Research Fleet arrives next month, James told his daughter as they walked. Maya had heard about the aliens who were coming to study what humans had done. 12 different species, including some that had never left their home systems before, all because of what her parents' generation had accomplished. Are you nervous about showing them around? Maya asked. James smiled. They're the ones who should be nervous. Wait until they see what your generation is planning. Maya grinned back. The first Martian-born humans had grown up thinking of impossible as a starting point rather than an end point. While their parents had terraformed Mars, Maya's generation was already designing projects that would make the original terraforming look simple. They had plans for floating cities in the upper atmosphere, underwater colonies in the new Martian oceans, space elevators grown rather than built, using modified crystal trees that could reach into orbit. "Speaking of plans," James said, "your mother wants to show you something before the aliens arrive." They took a transport to the North Polar region, where Commander Sarah was overseeing humanity's latest impossible project. Maya had heard rumors, but she wasn't prepared for what she saw. A mountain was growing. Mount Olympus was already the tallest mountain in the solar system, Sarah explained to her daughter. But it was inactive. We thought, why not give Mars a proper landmark? The mountain was covered with organisms that looked like metallic moss. But this moss was designed to process minerals from deep in the planet and build them into new rock formations. The mountain was growing taller every day, shaped by human engineering and Martian life working together. "The aliens are going to love this," Maya said. "Wait until they see what it does." As Maya watched, the mountain began to glow. The metallic organisms were processing solar energy and geothermal heat, turning the entire mountain into a massive battery for the planet's growing energy needs. "It's beautiful," Maya breathed. "And functional," Sarah added. "By next year it will generate enough power for 3 new cities." Maya looked around at the landscape. Everywhere she could see, life was growing in forms that had never existed before. Crystal forests that sang in the wind, lakes filled with organisms that glowed like stars, rivers that flowed uphill, powered by the gravitational effects of the mountain's growth. "How did you know it would work?" Maya asked her parents. James and Sarah looked at each other. "We didn't," James admitted. "We just knew it had to work." "Because the alternative was giving up," Sarah added, "and humans don't give up." 1 month later, the Galactic Research Fleet arrived in Mars orbit. 12 ships from 12 different species, each one carrying the greatest scientists and engineers their civilizations could provide. Maya was chosen as one of the official guides, representing the first generation of true Martians. She met the alien delegation in the main reception hall of New Angels, a vast space with walls that grew like coral and a ceiling that showed the real Martian sky. The delegation leader was the same captain who had watched the transformation from the beginning. With him were representatives from every major galactic civilization. "Welcome to Mars," Maya said in perfect galactic standard. "I'm Maya and I was born here." The aliens made various sounds of interest. A being made of living crystal stepped forward. "You were born on Mars? How is this possible? The gravity, the atmosphere." "I was born in the domes," Maya explained. "But I grew up watching this world come to life. Today I can breathe the air and walk in the sunshine. Mars isn't just my home, it's my planet." She led them on a tour that left the alien scientists speechless. They saw the crystal forest where music played in frequencies that could calm any species. They visited the floating gardens where plants grew in midair, supported by controlled magnetic fields. They watched mountains that generated power and rivers that cleaned themselves. "This is not terraforming as we know it," said the crystal being. "This is something entirely new." "We call it anthropic terraforming," Maya said. "Instead of making worlds suitable for existing life, we make life suitable for the worlds." They visited a school where Martian-born children learned to design new organisms the way other species learned mathematics. Maya showed them young people who spoke to plants in chemical languages, who could sense magnetic fields, who thought about evolution the way their grandparents had thought about weather. "These children," whispered an alien that looked like a floating jellyfish, "they think differently than any species we have met." "They think like Martians," Maya said proudly. "This planet taught them to see possibilities instead of limitations." The tour ended at the observatory, where humans had built a telescope that used living organisms as lenses. The telescope could see deeper into space than any artificial instrument, because it evolved to see better every day. "The Galactic Consortium has a proposal," announced formally. "We would like to establish a permanent research station on Mars. We have much to learn from human methods." Maya looked at her parents, who had joined the group for the announcement. Was there too, now in her 70s but still sharp as the day she had stood before the consortium and refused to accept their limitations. "Of course," said But understand that on Mars, we do things differently. You'll need to check your assumptions at the airlock. What do you mean? Asked the Maya answered, on Mars, impossible just means nobody's figured it out yet. That night, the alien delegation sent reports to their governments that would change galactic civilization forever. They described technologies that shouldn't work, ecosystems that violated natural laws, and humans who treated the impossible as a daily challenge to overcome. The consortium formally adopted human terraforming principles as a new field of study. Species that had mastered space travel began sending their students to Mars to learn from teenagers who grew mountains for fun. Maya stood on the observation deck of New Angels, looking out at a world that her species had refused to accept as impossible. The sky showed 3 moons now, because humans had decided that Mars would look better with more satellites and had simply built them. Tomorrow, she would start work on her own project, turning asteroids into gardens that would orbit Mars like a ring of flying forests. Her parents had proved that Mars could live. Now it was her generation's job to prove that beauty had no limits. Just wait until they see what we do with Venus, she said to herself, watching the evening aurora paint the sky in colors that existed nowhere else in the universe. On Mars, impossible was just another word for next week's project. Doctor stood before the Galactic Scientific Consortium for the second time in her life. 43 years had passed since her first visit, when 12 alien species had told her that Mars was impossible. Today, she wore the silver robes of the Cosmic Engineering Council, the first human ever inducted into the body that guided terraforming projects across the galaxy. Her hair was white now, and her movements were slower, but her eyes held the same determination that had faced down the galaxy's greatest experts decades before. The consortium chamber looked the same, but everything else had changed. Representatives from 28 species sat in the circle now. 16 of those species had sent their minds to study on Mars. The other 12 were species that humans had helped contact after Mars became the galaxy's center for impossible engineering. Members of the consortium, began, 43 years ago, you told humanity that Mars would never live. Today, Mars is the most studied planet in the galaxy. Today, I stand before you to accept your offer to chair the first Galactic Committee on Anthropic Terraforming. The delegate who had once declared Mars impossible now rose to his feet in honor. Doctor, said, you have changed not just one world, but our understanding of what worlds can become. The consortium formally adopts human terraforming principles as our new standard for planetary engineering. Nodded graciously, but her mind was on Mars. Even now, 43 years after the first organisms had been released into Martian soil, the planet continued to evolve in ways that surprised its creators. Mars had not become Earth, it had become something better. The planet now supported 37 million humans across 12 major cities and hundreds of smaller settlements. But the people living there were no longer just colonists. They were Martians, adapted to their world as much as their world had been adapted to them. The cities themselves were marvels that drew tourists from across the galaxy. New Angels had grown into a complex of living buildings that stretched both deep underground and high into the sky. The buildings breathed with the planet, using temperature differences and atmospheric pressure to power themselves. Architecture that grew rather than being built, shaped by the same organisms that had terraformed the planet. But the real wonder was the landscape itself. The Valls had become the singing canyons, where crystal forests created music that could be heard from orbit. The sound was generated by the interaction of wind, magnetic fields, and the unique resonance properties of the Martian crystal trees. Scientists had tried to understand the physics, but the music seemed to follow its own rules. The northern lowlands were now the azure seas, vast bodies of water that supported ecosystems found nowhere else in the universe. The water itself was different from Earth's oceans, rich in minerals that created spectacular light shows when disturbed. Swimming in the azure seas was like moving through liquid starlight. Mount Olympus had become the beacon of Mars, a mountain that now reached partway into space and generated energy for the entire planet. The metallic organisms that covered it had evolved to process not just solar radiation, but cosmic rays, stellar wind, and even the gravitational effects of Mars's moons. The mountain literally fed on space itself. Most spectacular of all were the aurora gardens in the polar regions. The artificial magnetic field that humans had created had evolved far beyond its original purpose. Now it painted the Martian sky every night with displays that told stories, responded to the emotions of observers, and seemed to have moods of their own. The results speak for themselves, continued her address to the consortium. Mars now supports life that is more diverse than many worlds that evolved naturally over billions of years. The atmospheric pressure is optimal for 23 different known species types. The temperature ranges accommodate life forms from ice worlds to desert planets. She gestured, and a hologram of Mars appeared in the center of the chamber. It showed a world that was blue and green and gold, with swirls of color that moved like living art. But the greatest achievement is not what we did to Mars, said. It's what Mars did to us. The alien delegates leaned forward in interest. The children born on Mars think differently than any human generation before them, explained. They see problems as opportunities. They view impossible as a temporary condition. They design solutions that work with natural systems rather than fighting against them. She shared data that amazed even the most advanced alien scientists. The second generation of Martians had an average IQ 20 points higher than Earth humans. They could sense magnetic fields, had perfect balance in low gravity, and could hold their breath for hours in thin atmosphere. But more importantly, they thought about engineering and life in ways that produced constant breakthroughs. These young Martians are now working on projects that make our terraforming of Mars look simple, said. Floating cities in the clouds of Venus, underwater colonies in Europa's ocean, space habitats grown from modified asteroids. The delegate made the crystal sound that meant amazement. They are designing living spaceships. They're designing living solar systems, replied. One group wants to turn Jupiter's moons into a single connected ecosystem. Another is planning to build a sphere using organisms that feed on stellar radiation. She paused to let that sink in. Even after 40 years of watching human achievements, the aliens still struggled to keep up with human imagination. The consortium votes to establish the first galactic university on Mars, announced the delegate. All species may send students to learn human terraforming methods. Smiled, Mars welcomes all students, but remember our most important rule. Which is, check your assumptions at the airlock. Later that day, took a transport to the surface of Mars for what she knew would be her last visit. Age was catching up with her and Earth was calling her home. But first, she wanted to see the world she had helped create. She emerged from the transport at Station, one of the first human settlements on Mars. The dome where she had once given speeches about impossible dreams was now just a small part of a vast city that sprawled across the landscape like a living thing. Young Maya met her at the landing pad. Maya was now director of Martian development, in charge of the projects that would define the next generation of impossible achievements. How does it look from orbit? Maya asked as they walked through streets lined with crystal trees and flowing water. Like magic, replied honestly. They walked to the edge of the city, where the terraformed landscape stretched to the horizon. Gardens that had been designed by AI and grown by alien human organisms covered the land in patterns too complex for any natural evolution. Rivers that flowed uphill carried minerals to growing mountains. Animals that had never existed anywhere else grazed on grass that photosynthesized using magnetic fields. We're starting the next phase next month, Maya said. Which is, we're going to make Mars the first planet that can terraform itself. Self-improving ecosystems that evolve continuously to become more beautiful, more complex, more alive. Laughed, of course you are. The aliens think it's impossible. Good, said, that's when we do our best work. They stood together watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that existed nowhere else in the universe. 3 moons hung in the evening sky, each one now supporting its own ecosystem. The aurora began its nightly dance, creating patterns that seemed to tell stories about the day's achievements. Any regrets? Maya asked. Thought about the young woman who had stood before the Galactic Consortium all those years ago, facing down the combined wisdom of 12 ancient civilizations. That woman had promised to prove them wrong. She had done more than that. She had proved that wrong and right were human concepts, and humans had always been good at rewriting the rules. Just one, said finally. What? I wish I could be here to see what you do to the rest of the galaxy." Maya smiled, and in that smile saw the future. A galaxy where impossible was just another word for tomorrow's project. Where young humans would face down ancient alien wisdom and say, "That's nice, but we have a better idea." Where every world could become whatever its inhabitants dreamed it could be. "Don't worry," Maya said, looking up at the star-filled sky. "We'll make sure the universe knows that humans were here." Above them, the Martian aurora painted a message across the sky in letters of light. Mars lives, Mars dreams, Mars becomes. And in the distance, barely visible on the horizon, the first chutes of a space elevator began their impossible climb toward the stars, grown from seeds that remembered both Earth's ambitions and Mars's dreams. Humanity had turned a dead world into a living paradise. Now it was time to see what they could do with an entire galaxy.